In 1989, the 16-bit generation officially begun with the August release of both the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx-16. But that same year, the Nintendo Entertainment System was at the peak of its popularity, selling just under 10 million consoles here in North America. In 1991, the 16-bit generation turned into the famed 16-bit console wars with the August release of the Super Nintendo. The system launched with only 3 games, but by the time Christmas had arrived, a number of titles were on store shelves that would come to be considered absolute classics on the system. On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, following up on the launch of the Super Nintendo, we take a look at the noteworthy games that would flesh out the system's North American library through its first holiday season.
So that's the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
What about it?
They say it has 16-bit technology, whatever that means.
Oh, I see. What else do they say?
That it has 3D graphics and digital stereo sound, and that Super Mario World is included.
Okay, we'll get it for them.
The original Gradius was released into the arcades by Konami in 1985. The game is a horizontally scrolling shooter that uses a unique upgrade system in which you collect power-up tokens which can then be used to modify your ship. These upgrades include lasers, missiles, and options, which act as little helper ships, mirroring your movements and providing extra firepower. Tight controls, excellent music and visuals, and fair but challenging difficulty led to Gradius being a hit in the arcades. The game was ported to numerous home platforms and was one of the very first third-party titles released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. A sequel of sorts called Salamander in Japan and Life Force in the West was released into the arcades in 1986.
Destroy them all! Pick it up for multiple. Pick it up for missile. Pick it up for vertical laser.
It was subsequently ported to the Famicom and NES in 1987 and is easily one of the best shooters on the platform. In 1988, a proper sequel, Gradius II Gopher no Yabo, known as Vulcan Venture in the West, was released into the arcades. The Famicom version released the same year as a very respectable port, and it's a real shame that the game was never localized here in the West. The 1992 Super CD port, which was also never localized here, is much closer to arcade perfect and is, in my opinion, one of the very best horizontally scrolling shooters on the PC Engine. In 1989, the third installment in the main series, Gradius III, appeared in Japanese arcades, and it was this game that was in turn ported to the Super Famicom and released on the Super Nintendo about a week after the launch of the system. As Gradius II was never released here in its day, Gradius III was, for us, the follow-up to the two NES titles. In Gradius III, you once again pilot the Vic Viper, fighting against the hordes of the Bacterion Empire in a game that should feel instantly familiar to veterans of the 8-bit installments. While Gradius III is not a huge audio-visual leap over Gradius II, the game still has gorgeous graphics and tremendous variety between stages, which arguably is characteristic of the franchise. Series tropes like Moai heads and cave levels are joined by variations on a theme, like sand dragons standing in for fire dragons, and gigantic bubbles that break into smaller ones when shot. The graphics in Gradius III might not look as obviously next-gen as the visual effects used in F-Zero or Pilotwings, but the game does an excellent job of taking advantage of the Super Nintendo's expanded color palette to create pixel art that achieves a level of detail expectedly not yet seen in the series. Unfortunately, when some of these early Super Nintendo games were being created, developers were, for obvious reasons, not able to take advantage of the Super Nintendo's 16-bit processor, and as a result, some games suffer from severe slowdown. As might be expected, this was one of the chief criticisms of Gradius III back in its day, as, generally speaking, shooters were most susceptible to slowdown due to the sheer volume of action happening on the screen at any given time. Gradius III's power-up system now has an edit mode, which allows you to choose which power-ups will be available to you during the game. The advantage of this is that it allows you to tailor the upgrade system to suit your style of play. As has been the case with all games in the series, powering up your ship is the key to success, and starting again at zero with a slow ship and a pea shooter when you die can be a serious shock. Excellent music composed by the Konami Square Wave Club is a hallmark of practically every Konami game, and Gradius III is no exception, using the Super Nintendo's Ken Kutaragi designed sound chip to excellent effect. I personally think the game is harder than previous installments, but as is the case with the series as a whole, Gradius III is a challenging but rewarding game that simply requires practice to master. Both the original Gradius and Life Force are among my favorite games on the NES, and as such, slowdown aside, Gradius III would have been well worth purchasing in the late summer of 1991. Raid on Bungling Bay was created by video game designer Will Wright and released on the Commodore 64 in 1984. While designing the game, Wright purportedly felt that he had more fun creating the layouts in his level editor than he did playing the game itself. And his subsequent fascination with level editors culminated in the development of SimCity. The game was designed in 1985 for the Commodore 64, but was not released at the time due to lack of interest from game publishers. In 1987, Wright co-founded Maxis Software, breathing new life into SimCity.
To increase the amount of creativity a user could put into the system.
In 1989, the game finally made its retail debut on both the Amiga and the original black and white 68K Macintosh, and the following year was finally released on the Commodore 64, as well as the DOS PC, where it became one of the most beloved games of my adolescence. SimCity is an interesting game in that it has no clear objective. You start off with an empty swath of land and must set up infrastructure in the form of power lines and roads, and set zoning for parcels of land, either residential, commercial, or industrial. You then watch as residents and businesses move in, increasing your population and, hopefully, your tax revenue, giving you the capital needed to expand. You set tax rates, manage crime with the strategic placement of police stations, and respond to the needs of your citizens by building airports, stadiums, and parks. Unless you turn them off, you also have to deal with the occasional disaster, manifesting itself as a fire, tornado, or even an attack by a giant monster. Other than that, the game has no end, either good or bad. If you completely run your city into the ground and have no money to fix it, then you have no choice but to restart, but there is no official game over. On the other hand, for as long as you're having some modicum of success, you can continue to tinker with your city indefinitely. The game also includes a handful of scenarios, based on real-world situations, in which you do have specific goals, but even if you fail to achieve them, you can still keep playing the game. In 1990, under license from Maxis, Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Group, famously led by Shigeru Miyamoto, programmed from scratch a version of SimCity for release on their 16-bit platform. As with Gradius III, the game missed the console's North American launch by about a week, but is erroneously considered by some to be a launch title. While the most popular version of the game, at least here, was probably the DOS release, this Super Nintendo installment most closely resembles the more colorful Amiga version. The game plays much the same as every other iteration, but with the expected infusion of some Nintendo magic. Unlike the original game, in this version you're awarded special structures, the first being the mayor's house, and after achieving 500,000 residents, you're given a statue of Mario to place wherever you see fit. It also includes some graphical touches like the seasons changing, and Bowser standing in as the monster as one of the possible disasters. While SimCity would have been perfect for use with the Super Nintendo's mouse, that peripheral was not released until the following year, and is therefore not compatible with this game. That being said, I had no problem playing with the controller, and that's coming from someone who spent countless hours playing this game with a mouse on a computer. The soundtrack for SimCity was composed by Soyo Oka, who also co-composed the music for Pilotwings along with Koji Kondo, and would go on to write the music for Super Mario Kart. She also rearranged Kondo's original Super Mario Bros. Compositions for 1993's Super Mario All-Stars. This Super Nintendo version of the game may not be the ideal way to play SimCity for the modern retro gamer, but it is an excellent version of the game, and was certainly the most accessible means of playing SimCity back then for those who weren't fortunate enough to have access to a home computer. The original R-Type was developed for the arcades by Irem and began what is, for most people, their most well-known franchise. The game was released in 1987 and was actually distributed here in the United States by Nintendo, although the game was never ported to the NES. Ports were, however, released on a myriad of other platforms, including the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16, and the Sega Master System, where it was ported by Shooter Powerhouse Compile. R-Type has you piloting the R9A Arrowhead, fighting against the evil hordes of the Baido Empire. The franchise as a whole is known for its slower pace, but that doesn't make it any easier. Probably the two most noteworthy aspects of the gameplay are the ability to charge up your weapon for a more powerful shot, and the helper ship called the Force Pod. The Force Pod is picked up as a power-up and can attach to either the front or back of your ship, where it both adds extra firepower and acts as a shield of sorts. You can also send it out to act as a remote secondary weapon, which is particularly useful when it's equipped to shoot vertically instead of straight ahead. In 1989, Irem released R-Type 2, and the game feels and plays like a natural continuation of the original. As the game is 2 years newer, there's the expected bump in graphics and sound, with the only notable change to the gameplay being the ability to doubly charge your weapon for an even more powerful super shot. In 1991, Irem released a reworked version of the game on the Super Famicom as Super R-Type, and the game appeared on store shelves here in North America in early September. 4 of the game's stages are brought over from R-Type 2, but the other 3, including the unimaginative first level of the game, are newly designed. R-Type 2 was already harder than the original, but inexplicably the designers chose to remove mid-level checkpoints from this home version, meaning that when you die, even if during a boss battle, you have to start the entire level over again. The graphics in Super R-Type can best be described as inconsistent. In some levels, the bland backgrounds and muted color schemes make the game appear unimpressive, while other levels look much the opposite and show off what the Super Nintendo's expanded color palette brought to the table. Although perhaps not as severe as Gradius III, Super R-Type does suffer from some slowdown during frenzied periods of on-screen action. On the plus side, Irem took excellent advantage of the Super Nintendo's sound capabilities to make improvements to the game's soundtrack, and paired it with excellent sound effects. Super R-Type was well received upon release, but with the gift of hindsight, the game just falls flat, which explains why it's one of the cheapest big-name titles on the Super Nintendo. I don't enjoy this game as much as the original, and as such, were I in the market for a shooter in the fall of 1991, picking Gradius III over this game would have been an easy decision. While the original R-Type did not appear on either the Famicom or NES, Super R-Type belatedly brought the franchise to Nintendo's home hardware and set the stage for the outstanding home-exclusive R-Type 3, released for the Super Nintendo in 1994. In the mid to late 1980s, before the era of one-on-one fighters, beat-em-ups were among the most popular titles in the arcades. The genre naturally lends itself well to multiplayer play, and due to the immersive atmospheres and storylines combined with greater variety between stages, the games were more compelling when compared to many traditional single-screen arcade offerings. A pioneer in the field was Technos Japan, whose 1986 release Renegade set the stage stylistically for what we now consider a beat-em-up. They would follow this up the following year with the smash hit Double Dragon, and Sega would join the party in the spring of 1989 with Golden Axe. Predictably, Capcom wanted to jump into the mix and tasked Yoshiki Okamoto and Akira Yasuda with developing the company's first street brawler. Inspired by Double Dragon 2 and loosely based on the 1984 film Streets of Fire, the game was at one point written as the sequel to the original Street Fighter, even being demonstrated at trade shows under the title Street Fighter 89, before being released in 1989 on Capcom's then new CPS hardware as Final Fight. In the game, Metro City's mayor, ex-pro wrestler Mike Hager, is on a quest to rescue his kidnapped daughter from the Mad Gear Gang with the help of martial artists Cody and Guy. Final Fight, in my opinion, ushered in a new generation of beat-em-ups, setting a new standard for the genre. The game had, by far and away, the most detailed graphics and largest sprites yet seen in a beat-em-up, and introduced a level of control that made the aforementioned games feel primitive in comparison. As would come to be the norm, the game plays differently depending on which character you choose. Mike Hager is the slowest and has the weakest special attack, but makes up for it with the strongest normal attack and stoutest defense. Guy is the exact opposite, and Cody falls somewhere in between. Names and appearances of many of the enemies in the game take cues from 80s pop culture figures, most notably Andore, who is clearly a ripoff of the great Andre the Giant. Much as it had in the early days of the Genesis back in 1989 and 1990, Capcom played a major role in the Super Nintendo's early third-party lineup. Arriving in stores in late September, a port of Final Fight was the first of 3 games that the company would release on the Super Nintendo in 1991. This version is a passable home translation with a few unfortunate omissions. The ability to play cooperatively is of course a hallmark of the beat-em-up genre, but the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight famously lacks a simultaneous two-player mode. Guy, who has always been my character of choice, has also been omitted, as has the industrially themed fourth level. In both cases supposedly due to the limited memory capacity of cartridges in the early days of the system. This version is also noticeably easier than the arcade original, although I'm not sure I'd call that a flaw. Final Fight is often compared to the Streets of Rage series in much the same way that Gradius seems forever linked to R-Type. Final Fight was released on the Super Nintendo not long after the first Streets of Rage on the Genesis, with reviews for the two games even appearing side by side in the August 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. Final Fight would sell nearly 1.5 million copies on the Super Nintendo, and was one of Capcom's most successful games on Nintendo's 16-bit hardware. While it's far less arcade perfect than the 1993 release on the Sega CD, it's still one of the better beat-em-ups on the system, and was at the very least worth a rental or two in the early days of the Super Nintendo. Another 1989 Capcom CPS release, Area 88 is an arcade shooter based on the manga and anime series of the same name, centered around a group of young mercenary fighter pilots based in the Middle East. Similar to the aforementioned Final Fight, at the beginning of the game you choose from 3 available characters, each of whom fly a different plane which draws its strengths from its real-world counterpart. Shin Kazama, who is the protagonist of the original manga series, flies the agile F-20 Tiger Shark and is ostensibly the most balanced of the 3 characters. Mickey Simon's F-14 Tomcat, made famous by the 1985 movie Top Gun, has a stronger forward weapon with a slightly slower rate of fire, but is still the best character for air-to-air combat. Finally, Greg Gates, who is in the manga and anime a fairly minor character but a fan favorite, flies the A-10 Thunderbolt, whose weapon lacks punch but shoots both straight ahead and at a downward angle, making it a jack of all trades but master of none. Unlike more traditional games like Gradius and R-Type, Area 88 eschews the ubiquitous space shooter paradigm, instead taking place right here on planet Earth. While Capcom already had experience creating shooters in the pseudo-realistic realm with the vertically scrolling 1942 series, Area 88 is a side-scrolling affair. Perhaps a carryover from 1943, this game features a health bar instead of one-hit kills, but as a result you have just 1 life. Like fellow CPS release Forgotten Worlds, Area 88 features an interstage shop. As a mercenary, defeating enemies earns you money, which can then be used to purchase secondary weapons including a variety of missiles and bombs, as well as defensive power-ups including shields and maximum health increases. Each airplane is tied to its primary weapon, which can be upgraded over the course of the game by picking up power-ups dropped by enemies. Differently colored tokens are worth different denominations of POW points, and once you accumulate enough of them, your weapon levels up. Area 88 was brought to Western arcades as UN Squadron, an odd choice since by that time the original manga series had been localized here. The game was ported to the Super Nintendo in 1991 and was shipped out to stores in late September alongside Final Fight. While the game was the 3rd horizontally scrolling shooter to be released in the span of about a month, UN Squadron was unique enough to be worthy of consideration, having undergone a number of changes while being remade for the Super Nintendo. In the arcade, the game uses a standard linear level progression, but this home version features a map screen that to a certain extent allows you to choose the order in which you play the game, and also adds some bonus levels, giving you further opportunity to earn some extra cash. This is particularly helpful because the game no longer ties each character to a particular aircraft, instead allowing you to purchase pricey new airplanes in the shop. Naturally, UN Squadron gets progressively harder as you advance and does require a certain amount of memorization, but like any good shooter, it never feels cheap. While both Gradius III and Super R-Type primarily took place in the cold starkness of space, the terrestrial settings of UN Squadron give it a visual warmth that the other two games lack. Expectedly, the graphics took a hit coming home from the arcade, but the game still looks great, and like Super R-Type, doesn't suffer from too much slowdown. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is fairly unremarkable, and while the explosions sound cool, much as it did in the arcade, your plane's primary weapon sounds like an old man blowing his nose. The arcade game of course allowed for two-player simultaneous play, but once again Capcom has removed this feature in the home version, although I don't think it's as big a deal in a shooter as it is in a beat-em-up. Overall, this is a great game that really did something a little bit different with the genre, and would have been for me, alongside Gradius III, a must-buy shooter in the fall of 1991. Easily the most unique game in the Super Nintendo's early lineup, ActRaiser is a combination god game and side-scrolling action platformer. The game was the first developed by Tokyo-based Quintet, who would go on to design Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, and was published by Enix of Dragon Warrior fame, appearing on North American store shelves in the last week of October. In the original Japanese version, you play the role of God, battling Satan for control of the Earth. But for the Super Nintendo release, in order to cater to Western sensibilities, God was changed to the Master, and Satan to Tanzra, so as not to ruffle the wrong feathers. In any case, the evil deity and his minions have taken over the land, and it's up to you as the good deity to clean some house and make the land again safe for habitation. ActRaiser's world features 6 unique lands, in which the simulation mode is sandwiched in between 2 action-based stages. Once you set your game up in the Sky Palace, you begin the first stint of action platforming after a sweet Mode 7 transition. Here, both the ambiance and the manner in which your character handles reminds me of Wizards and Warriors on the NES. At the beginning of the game, your character has no magic, so your only offensive weapon is your sword. The first stage acts as sort of an initial house cleaning to make the land hospitable for your people, so that after the boss battle you can transition into your first simulation stint and help your people establish themselves. As the simulation mode begins, your first task is to direct your people to build toward the monster layers from the newly constructed temple, allowing for them to be sealed by the locals. Until they do so, you'll have to use your cherub, who acts as both consultant and your boots-on-the-ground proxy, to dispatch the various enemies still wandering free, including bats, imps, and what look like baby dragons. You also listen to the prayers of your people and respond accordingly, doing things like burning bushes, and accepting offerings which help you progress through the game. Once all of the monster layers are sealed, you can trigger the second action platforming stage, the completion of which will finally rid the land of evil and allow you to move on to the next area. The action portions of ActRaiser easily have some of the best graphics among the Super Nintendo's 1991 lineup, with awesome sprite design paired with excellent background detail. The game's bosses in particular are gorgeous to look at and are reminiscent of those found in the Castlevania series. ActRaiser's sim sections look understandably less impressive, as developers necessarily sacrificed graphical detail in favor of a larger viewable area. The soundtrack for ActRaiser was written by the great Yuzo Koshiro, better known for his work on the Sega Genesis with Revenge of Shinobi and the Streets of Rage series. The church-like organ music in the Sky Palace and the classically inspired theme of the overworld sound great and are setting appropriate, but perhaps predictably, Yashiro's talent really shines through during the game's action sequences. While on their own, neither of ActRaiser's game modes would make the game a standout title, it's their seamless integration that makes the game so engrossing. In 1993, the critically panned ActRaiser II was released, and did away with the overhead sim-style gameplay, even advertising on the front of the box that it was 100% pure action and excitement, but in doing so got rid of what made the original so memorable. ActRaiser does let you play straight through the 12 action stages of the game using the Professional mode, unlocked once you've beaten the game, and so named because the enemies are harder to kill and you have no magic. ActRaiser is an excellent game that unfortunately suffers from being both too short and too easy, which back in 1991 would have, for me, relegated it to weekend rental territory. The game is still a solid must-play, however, and is absolutely worth tracking down today. Bases Loaded was released by Jaleco in the summer of 1988, with its TV-style behind-the-picture perspective likely influenced by the popular 80s home computer game Hardball. Although not licensed by the MLB or MLBPA, the option to play a complete season, clear digitized speech, and reasonably good music and visuals made it one of the most popular baseball games of the 8-bit era. In early November of 1991, Jaleco brought the franchise to the Super Nintendo with Super Bases Loaded, right around the same time that Bases Loaded 3 was being released on the NES. For both games, Jaleco paid for a celebrity endorsement from future Hall of Fame second baseman Ryne Sandberg, then playing for the Chicago Cubs, but he does not appear in the game. Super Bases Loaded maintains the same TV-style presentation ostensibly intended to make the game more immersive, and while the graphics are nothing special, the game does sprinkle in a little bit of Mode 7. The digitized speech is again crystal clear, but the audio as a whole makes it sound like you're playing the game in a bathroom. The removal of the pennant race mode cuts down on the game's replay value, and overall there's really nothing here that would make me want to upgrade from any number of baseball games on the NES. Those would include Culture Brain's Baseball Simulator 1000, which while not as well known as heavy hitters like RBI Baseball or Bases Loaded, was one of the better baseball games on the system. The game allows you to both create your own teams and play full seasons, which already sets it apart from the majority of baseball games on the NES. Although you can play a game of straight baseball, the use of the word simulator in the title is a bit ironic, since what really makes Baseball Simulator 1000 stick out from the crowd is the over-the-top arcade-style play of the Ultra League. Here you have access to what the game calls Ultra Plays, which include a number of trick hits and pitches, adding a whole new layer of fun to the game of baseball. Making it out sometime before Christmas, in 1991, Culture Brain released Super Baseball 1000 on the Super Nintendo. The game retains the features of the 8-bit original while adding a bevy of new Ultra plays. As one would expect, the game's visuals have improved, but Super Baseball Simulator 1000 certainly doesn't push the 16-bit envelope, and I wish they had chosen a brighter color palette. The first game had an excellent soundtrack, and that continues to be the case with this iteration, which features organ-based music that fits right in with the genre. Were you hoping for a baseball game for your Super Nintendo under the tree on Christmas morning, you'd have much preferred it to be this one. The most famous football franchise in the history of video games got its start on the Apple II home computer with the 1988 release of John Madden Football. The series continued on the Sega Genesis with a game that revolutionized sports gaming on home consoles. John Madden Football came closer to simulating the game of football than any video game released prior, with the full 11 players per side on the field, penalties, a proper play clock, and perhaps most importantly, the signature Madden playbook. Although it was far from perfect, upon its release in the fall of 1990, John Madden Football was, in terms of immersion and realism, the greatest football video game ever created. In the fall of 1991, John Madden Football 92 appeared on the Genesis at about the same time as the series made its debut on the Super Nintendo. This installment of the franchise was highly anticipated by sports gamers who thought that the Super Nintendo's advanced scaling and rotation effects were going to take the series to the next level. The game has the same options found on the Genesis, meaning that while you can't play a full season, you can at least play through a complete playoff tournament. The game lacks NFL and NFLPA licenses, a feature that wouldn't be seen in the franchise until Madden 94. Unfortunately, starting a game, it becomes evident that John Madden Football wasn't able to live up to the pre-release hype, with a choppy frame rate that makes the game almost unplayable. On the plus side, this Super Nintendo release has better color and therefore more detail than the Genesis games, and although both games share many of the same sound samples, they sound much clearer on the Super Nintendo than on the Genesis, although that's to be expected as both are strengths of the former system and weaknesses of the latter.
First down!
Overall, the first installment of John Madden Football on the Super Nintendo was a disappointment for gamers who had no other choice if they insisted on playing football on Nintendo's 16-bit platform in 1991. With apologies to Darius Rucker, aka Hootie, the most famous Darius was probably Darius the Great, who ruled the Persian Empire at the peak of its power from 522 to 486 BC. The Darius video game franchise, on the other hand, got its start almost 2,500 years later, when Taito released the ichthyologically themed original in 1987. The game was housed in a unique arcade cabinet that used 3 CRTs to create an ultra-widescreen display. The game and the franchise as a whole is known for its choose-your-own-adventure style of level progression and its aforementioned pseudo-aquatic theme, pitting you as the pilot of the Silverhawk against the mechanized marine life of the Belsar Empire. At the outset, your ship is equipped with both a standard cannon and bombs, with enemies dropping color-coded power-ups that upgrade either your gun, bombs, or shields. Darius is eye-poppingly colorful and has a great soundtrack, but the Silverhawk's slow rate of fire and enemies that take multiple hits to kill prevent the game from providing as much fun as its contemporaries. Permutations of the arcade original made appearances on a variety of home gaming platforms, but obviously there was no practical way to preserve the 3-screen format. After releasing an arcade sequel in 1989, Taito developed a game specifically designed for the single-screen format of home consoles. On a system not really known for shooters, Darius Twin was the fourth released on the Super Nintendo in a 3-month window, and was so named because it was the only of the 4 shooters to feature simultaneous 2-player play. While the arcade titles are known for their unique widescreen display, here Darius makes a successful transition to home TV screens. As is, in my opinion, a cornerstone of the series, Darius Twin features impressive sprite artwork, though this game does recycle elements from previous titles. Some of Darius Twin's diverse locales are absolutely gorgeous, if somewhat familiar, and in many ways the game's graphics rival those of Gradius III. The gameplay is buttery smooth and amazingly suffers from no slowdown. Again, you have both your primary forward-facing cannon and a secondary weapon that initially drops bombs but can be upgraded to shoot in all 4 diagonal directions, making it an effective means of protecting your flanks. As was the case with previous entries in the series, most enemies in the game require multiple shots to kill, which I guess is just a pet peeve of mine. Although the game allows you to adjust your number of lives in the options menu, it gives you no continues. On the other hand, the difficulty of the gameplay itself has been scaled back from the arcade titles, with Darius Twin allowing you to keep your power-ups when you die. With a fully powered-up ship, the game can become almost too easy, as by using both weapons at the same time you can knock out enemies all over the screen. The level progression is less branched but still non-linear, and features fewer levels overall than previous entries in the series. Darius Twin can be beaten in about 30 minutes, though multiple playthroughs are required in order to see every stage in the game, enhancing its replay value. Having looked at all 4 shooters released on the Super Nintendo in 1991, I think I would rank them thusly. Slowdown aside, Gradius III stands out as the best, UN Squadron comes in second thanks to its personality and replayability, and Darius Twin sneaks onto the final podium spot, ahead of the disappointing Super R-Type. When the original Final Fantasy was released on the Famicom in 1987, its success was both a surprise and savior, with the professional fate of its creator Hironobu Sakaguchi hanging in the balance. Sakaguchi had dropped out of a university engineering program 4 years earlier to design games for the newly formed Square Company Limited, but had become disillusioned after creating both the 3D Battles of World Runner and Highway Star, released in the West as Rad Racer. Inspired by games like Ultima and Wizardry, Sakaguchi set out to design a role-playing game as his farewell performance before leaving Square and returning to school to finish his degree. Programmed by Nasir Jabeli, who was already a household name to Apple II gamers, and scored by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, Final Fantasy was an epic undertaking, requiring a 15-person team to complete. Along with the iconic Dragon Quest series, Final Fantasy is the game most closely associated with the Japanese subgenre of role-playing games, known acronymically as JRPGs, and characterized by random battle encounters and turn-based fighting. Unlike Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy allows the player to create their own party at the game's outset, choosing the class of each character for a more customized gameplay experience. The game also has a more compelling storyline and superior artwork thanks in part to the work of character designer Yoshitaka Amano. The Japanese public, whose appetite for RPGs had been whet by the first installment in the aforementioned Dragon Quest series in 1986, scooped up hundreds of thousands of copies of Final Fantasy, giving Sakaguchi's career a new lease on life and propelling Square from near anonymity to marquee third-party developer in the coming years. Based on its success in Japan, in the spring of 1990, Nintendo of America localized and published Final Fantasy, releasing it here to moderate success. 2 more games were released on the Famicom, but due to the delay in releasing the original in North America, Square and Nintendo chose to skip localizing the 8-bit sequels in favor of Final Fantasy IV, which was released on the Super Famicom in the summer of 1991. As it was the second entry in the series to be released in the West, the name was changed to Final Fantasy II, and the game was in stores in the middle of November, just in time to take advantage of the Christmas shopping season. Final Fantasy II initially sold for $69.99, and while the high price of RPGs on the Super Nintendo is often blamed on the price of ROM chips, Final Fantasy II was just 8 megabits, as was the majority of the console's 1991 lineup. As the series moved from the anonymous heroes of the first game to characters with defined personality and backstory, you can no longer create custom parties, but that simply comes as a trade-off for the more complex storylines and deeper character development that this game has to offer. The plot centers around the Dark Knight Cecil, who at the outset of the game serves as captain of the Red Wings, an airship-based fighting force, but is demoted for challenging the king's motives for stealing elemental crystals from neighboring kingdoms. As it turns out, a sinister force is behind the thievery, and it's up to Cecil and his revolving cast of supporting characters to save the world. Designed by Takashi Tokita with Sakaguchi serving as director, the game plays more like an interactive epic, and really helped set the stage for subsequent Japanese role-playing games. Final Fantasy II also marked the first Western appearance of series mainstays, including Sid, Chocobos, and active time battles, which put a unique spin on turn-based fighting. Japanese-style role-playing games are fairly polarizing in the Western gaming community, either people love them or hate them, and usually this hinges on how one feels about the random battle encounters, the frequency of which in Final Fantasy II is elevated to say the least. Final Fantasy II makes excellent use of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 on the overworld, and the game's graphics as a whole are serviceable if unremarkable. Once again written by Nobuo Uematsu, the game's soundtrack really makes the system's sound chip sing, and as would be a defining feature of the franchise, the music serves as the primary driver of the mood in any given scene. Final Fantasy II is a great game in its own right and raised the bar for 16-bit JRPGs, setting the stage for subsequent Square releases like Final Fantasy III, which is considered by some to be the best game in the franchise, and the universally acclaimed Chrono Trigger. Even at $69.99, the tens of hours of entertainment value that this game had to offer would have made it an easy must-buy upon its release, and I suspect that it found itself on countless Christmas wish lists. Makaimura, or Demon World Village, was created by video game designer Tokuro Fujiwara, released by Capcom in 1985, and brought west as Ghosts and Goblins. Princess Prin Prin has been kidnapped by Satan himself, and it's up to you, playing as Sir Arthur, to rescue her from the demonic horde. Ghosts and Goblins is an action platformer best known for its engagingly spooky atmosphere, variety of weapons and enemies, and crushing difficulty, along with neat graphical touches like Arthur rocking a pair of boxer shorts if he loses his armor. A substandard port was released on the Famicom and NES, but still managed to be one of the more popular games on the platform, selling just under 1.7 million copies. In 1988, its sequel, Dai Makaimura, or Great Demon World Village, debuted on Capcom's CPS hardware and was released in the West as Ghouls'n Ghosts. A Yuji Naka programmed home port was one of the first games released on the Sega Genesis and retains both its signature atmosphere and challenging gameplay. Notable additions include the ability to shoot straight up and down, and the appearance of treasure chests, which contain either a weapon, an evil magician who transforms you into one of two hapless forms if you don't kill him fast enough, or a gold armor upgrade, which allows you to charge your weapon for a more powerful shot. In 1991, Capcom released Cho Makaimura, or Ultra Demon World Village on the Super Famicom. Rather than being developed for the arcades, the game was purpose-designed for Nintendo's 16-bit hardware. In late November, the game became Capcom's last release of the year on the Super Nintendo when it hit store shelves as Super Ghouls'n Ghosts. Series protagonist Sir Arthur has made some bad decisions regarding dating venues in the past, but to be fair has a reasonable expectation of safety, keeping Princess Prin inside the walls of the castle. The demons, of course, have other ideas, and away we go. Super Ghouls'n Ghosts does little to reinvent the wheel, predictably dropping you off in a zombie-infested graveyard armed with the familiar lance. You now, however, have the ability to double jump, which can immediately be used to uncover the first treasure chest. Again, along with the returning evil magician, they contain armor upgrades and a host of new weapons. The double jump also allowed the designers to get more creative with the platforming, requiring the maneuver in order to progress through certain parts of the game. With the aforementioned armor upgrades comes an upgrade to your offensive abilities. The bronze armor enchants your weapon with magical abilities, and as was the case with Ghouls'n Ghosts, the gold armor allows you to charge up a magic attack. The specifics of which depend on which weapon you have. You can also pick up a shield, which will allow you to absorb at least one additional frontal attack. While the game does suffer from the familiar slowdown, as expected, the graphics are the most colorful the series had seen up to that point. And Capcom even snuck in some well-executed Mode 7 rotation. Super Ghouls'n Ghosts also has, in my opinion, the best atmosphere and variety of levels among any game in the series. Mari Yamaguchi, who also wrote the music for Mega Man 5 and rearranged the Street Fighter II soundtrack for its 1993 release on the PC Engine, wrote the entire soundtrack for this game, with the exception of the map screen music and the first level track, as both are series standards. Common among many multi-platform franchises during the 16-bit era, here the Super Nintendo installment has by far and away the best music in the series. As stated, the franchise has a reputation for being brutally difficult, and Super Ghouls' Ghosts gives no quarter in that regard. Oddly, Capcom chose to remove the ability to attack above or below your character, which obviously doesn't make the game any easier. However, just like the previous entries in the series, the challenge is part of what makes the game compelling, and the game was no doubt under many a Christmas tree in 1991. The last game released for the Super Nintendo in 1991 hit store shelves just before Christmas. Super Castlevania IV was actually the 9th game, not the 4th, released in Konami's signature franchise between 1987 and 1991. It was preceded by, in order of release, the original game on the NES, Vampire Killer on the MSX, Simon's Quest, the lesser-known Haunted Castle in the arcade, Castlevania the Adventure on the Game Boy, Dracula's Curse, Boku Dracula-kun on the Famicom if you want to count that one, and Belmont's Revenge. The Japanese version of Super Castlevania IV is a reimagining of the original Castlevania, as it retells an alternate version of the same story. It's 1691, evil forces have resurrected Dracula, and it's up to Simon Belmont and his trusty vampire killer whip to, well, kill him. For its North American localization, however, the story was altered in a way that doesn't really make sense, so the game is not considered to be part of the official Castlevania timeline. While I'm a huge fan of at least 2 of the games on the NES, fairly unforgiving controls were a defining feature of the franchise up to this point. Super Castlevania IV, on the other hand, gives you much more control over your character. You can adjust your movement mid-air after a jump, can whip in any direction, and can jump onto staircases rather than starting only at the top or bottom. While these features do make the game easier than its predecessors, they also make the game more fun to play. Speaking of difficulty, this game is, in my opinion, the easiest Castlevania game of the 8 and 16-bit eras. The boss battles in particular are generally a cakewalk, and I usually find myself dying through more mundane means. One of the hallmarks of the Castlevania franchise is the atmosphere in each game, created from a combination of the visual art style, level layouts, and music. This game uses the Super Nintendo's expanded color palette to create a level of detail not seen in previous entries in the franchise, and the use of the console's Mode 7 scaling and rotation, while at times nausea-inducing, added to Super Castlevania's impressive visual chops. No conversation about Super Castlevania IV would be complete without talking about the game's amazing soundtrack. The game was scored by Taro Kudo and Masanori Adachi, who were both newcomers to the series, but who delivered one of the best soundtracks that the franchise has seen to date. Sadly, the only other Castlevania game to make an appearance on the Super Nintendo was 1995's Dracula X, a reworked but heavily altered version of Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine that largely fell flat. Super Castlevania IV is one of my all-time favorite Super Nintendo games, making it an obvious must-buy back in December of 1991, and is still a must-play game to this day. The following additional titles were released on the Super Nintendo in 1991. Populous by Bullfrog The Chess Master by Software Toolworks. Draken by Kemco Seika. Ultraman by Nova Games Limited. Hole-in-One Golf by HAL Laboratories. Bill Lambier's Combat Basketball by Hudson Soft. Super Tennis by Tosei. True Golf Classics YLA Country Club by T&E Soft. Hyperzone by HAL Laboratories. RPM Racing by Silicon and Synapse. And Home Alone by Imagineering Incorporated.